Hello, my name is Jenna Fontaine. My film is called Edward Scissorhands. The extract is from 26 minutes and 39 seconds until 31 minutes and 23 seconds. I selected this section because it demonstrates Edward's quest to be normal. It's important because he's willing to go to great lengths in order to blend with society. It also shows his great talents that lead him to become a valued member of the neighborhood, such as how he cuts the hedges into cool shapes and stuff. It also shows an outsider's negative perspective due to his deformity. That view becomes central toward the end because the neighbors who once valued him turn on him when they see that he's dangerous. Tim Burton can be associated with many dark fantasies such as Nightmare Before Christmas, Corpse Bride, Beetlejuice, and Batman Returns, so we can tell that he enjoys child-friendly stories with a dark twist on them. He produced, directed, and wrote this movie. He may have made it because of how personal it is. I believe his intent of the film is to show that there are many outsiders like Edward who are just struggling to fit in. So people should give them a chance to present their good qualities instead of just judging them on their bad qualities. The style of acting in this extract is realistic to the point where everything that happens we expect of that actor. For example, Esmeralda is very eccentric in her behavior when she confronts Edward. We aren't really surprised when she comes up and points her finger at Edward. Edward is gentle because he's naive about human nature. He doesn't really know much about society, so we can see that with his soft voice and his little smiles that he does, or even his just neutral facial expressions. The effect of this style is that we can tell which characters to like and dislike. For example, the way Esmeralda presents herself, like she sounds pretty crazy, so we can tell that we don't really like her. But Edward, he just has a really gentle voice, and he says, for example, "We're not sheep," when she accuses them of being lost sheep. And so it shows that he doesn't really understand what she said about him, and we like that because he feels sympathetic toward it. There are a lot of point of view shots of Edward being beautified that create the idea that he has to be changed in order to be accepted by society. This is followed by a close-up reverse point of view shot of Edward with a smile that turns into a frown at Peg's disappointment with her beauty products. The way Edward is staring at the audience, even though it's really at Peg, shows how he communicates his mood because he is willing to take what Peg does to him, as ridiculous as it is, just so he can fit in. Another interesting shot is when Bill's out working in the yard and Edward joins him. The shot has great depth because we have the branches in the foreground, Bill is in the midground, and Edward comes in the background. Then it cuts down the Z-axis to a medium close-up of Edward cutting a branch like Bill. What makes these shots significant is that Edward literally and figuratively comes out from the background and into the foreground by showing the audience that there's something he can do just like everyone else when he cuts the branch. A bit later, the branch is in the foreground, Edward is in the midground, and Bill is in the background, thus showing the significant change in dominance over the scene and highlighting Edward's importance. The final shot of the scene is most important because it is slightly from a worm's eye view as we witness Edward's botanical masterpiece. The angle of the shot shows that Edward has officially proven his worth and skill. Another important aspect is that the wide shot reflects the colossal stature of Edward's achievement. As a whole, the scene creates meaning because it physically shows that Edward becomes an important figure in the lives of everyone in the neighborhood because of his skill. One last important shot of the scene is when Esmeralda enters. The camera dollies in with the woman, showing that we're coming from an outsider's perspective. This is important because eventually this negative outside perspective becomes a neighborhood-wide feeling. Meaning is created through prosemics such that Edward is close to Peg, but he's distant from Bill. During the makeup session, Edward's really close to Peg, like Peg's putting the gunk on his face, but he takes it and he just thinks, well, she's helping me. She trusts her with his life. But when they're out in the yard, Bill doesn't even acknowledge Edward's presence until the very end when we see the big dinosaur that he made from the hedge. So he's very distant from Bill the entire time. This is important because the rest of the neighbors turn their back on him, and Bill and Kim aren't really coming to his defense when things get rough, but Peg and eventually Kim, when she becomes a major character, they're the ones who stick with him. One interesting part of the editing is how the first scene of the extract is drawn out. The men are all going off to work, but it emphasizes how uniform this society is. It's quite a long shot, but it shows how they're all leaving at the same time, they all get in the cars at the same time, they all leave the neighborhood at the same time. It's really ironic also because they're supposed to be the human ones while he's artificial, but he is an odd one out in a group of men who aren't really their own people at all. The same. Meaning is also created through editing because of Edward's eagerness to please. During the makeup session, Peg is smiling and then she cocks her head and it turns into a frown. Right after, it cuts to a shot of Edward's smile turning into a frown. This is important because Edward realizes that he can be his own person with his own opinions and that people are okay about him being different. But still, he wants to please other people because they know what's better for him. Editing is also important when Bill and Edward are cutting the hedges because Bill cuts once, then Edward cuts once, and Bill cuts twice, and then Edward cuts twice. Edward's trying to send the message that he can do it just like Bill, if not better. This is important to the film as a whole because a major part of the plot involves him proving himself to society, to Peg, and especially Kim. Another important part of the cutting in the scene is that they wait until the very end of the scene to show Edward's dinosaur. The closest we get is a glimpse of him cutting, but they put it off until Bill and Kevin notice what's going on. This shows maximum intrigue. It's important because similarly to the rest of the film, we don't realize Edward's true potential until the end of the film. We see all the good things he does, but we don't realize that he's able to commit murder to Jim until the very end. The very first scene of the extract is of what a suburban weekday is supposed to be like. All the houses are pastel colors as well as the cars. It's also a really bright sunny day with a big blue sky and everything. All this suggests that Edward is becoming oriented into a world outside of his black castle, his black outfit thing, his hair, and his pale skin. Also, the lavender foundation on his face suggests that Edward is starting to blend, pun unintended, with the colorful new world. It's important to the rest of the film because it ultimately emphasizes the world he doesn't belong in, not only because of his paleness and black attire, but his unfortunate tendency to be unintentionally dangerous. Sound is really important in this extract because in the first scene of the cars leaving, we hear a non-diegetic, fast-tempo, orchestrated music suggesting anxiety because not only is it a brand new day, we don't know what will happen, but the neighbors still have yet to meet Edward and see who this curious figure is all about. It becomes cheerful with the harmony of voices, suggesting that we are in an ideal neighborhood, and so this is the world that Edward's coming into. Then the music comes to a hasty close with the makeup session, and I think that shows that Peg is the one who's used to Edward and that everyone else will be too. In the scene with the hedge cutting, there's diegetic baseball, like a baseball game going on the radio, and we don't really care about the sound of it. And it's kind of competing with Edward for who gets the attention of Bill and Kevin, but toward the end, the announcer says it's gone, it's out of here, it's history, and this matches Edward's determination on his new project, and we actually see that shot with this powerful expression. He's like cutting, he's furious and everything. And the uproar of the baseball crowd begins when we see Edward next to his dinosaur. This shows that we finally get his attention. There's an increase in volume. Basically, the scene holds a lot of meaning with the sound because Edward gradually becomes the center of attention. This appreciation of his skill is important to the film as a whole because it adds a sense of accomplishment in Edward that motivates him to become a valuable member of society. One leitmotif that I notice foreshadows the climax of the movie, and that is with the entrance of Esmeralda. When we first see her a few minutes earlier in the film, she's like playing the organ and she's like looking out the window like, why are all these people gathering around Peg's house? And later we hear this dark, slow tempo, kind of mid-frequency accordion music, and it's important to the rest of the film because it foreshadows that eventually no good can come of Edward's integration into society. Meaning is created through location by how Edward is working his way into an average white American suburban family. It's a very stereotypical image of an American family because they're also rich people, they're also poor people, and there's other ethnic groups to consider. It's also important because he's coming from a dark place, so it's like he's seeing the light for the first time. Also, in the hedge cutting scene, the hedge is first in the background, but eventually becomes the more significant and dominant hedge because Edward is cutting it. So that's important because it symbolizes how Edward is no longer in the shadows, but he's standing out in a positive way. So the target audience includes teenagers, older kids or preteens, and young adults. Even adults actually may enjoy its charm, and it has a great score. It addresses the audience with Edward's sweet character, and there's the fairy tale-like music and the magical ice and hedge sculptures. There's even occasional humor when Edward tries to fit in with society. There are so many people who've never noticed, or they have no friends, or they're too shy to integrate into our loud culture. This film can strongly connect to them. The film's historical significance as a part of film history is that, as Entertainment Weekly put it, Edward is Pinocchio with Freddy Krueger's hands. Edward is very gentle, he's so naive, he doesn't know anything about the outside world, just as Pinocchio is a curious boy, which gets him into a lot of trouble actually. But he also has the potential of being as murderous as Freddy Krueger. This can also relate to the setting, like the old films such as Dracula and everyone, because there's the classic castle, eerie castle, but it's a little ironic in this film because we expect someone like Dracula to come out, but someone as gentle as Edward comes out. The film's significance as a document of its time is that in the 1980s, people started supporting gay rights, and AIDS was first discovered in the early 80s. It relates to this film because Edward was an outsider at first, but people started to accept him as normal. In relation to AIDS, Edward's scissors are his deformity that eventually destroy him. Like, he has to be isolated from society again, much how AIDS destroyed its victims during that time and even now. In 1990, when the movie was made, there was still a lot of socio-cultural changes going on in America. For example, on October 27th, Congress repealed a law prohibiting gays from being admitted into the U.S. This can relate to Edward because he spent ages as an outcast, but Peg was the one who admitted him into the real world. Burton got the idea of this film from his suburban childhood in Burbank, where his parents bricked up his windows when he was a child, so he only had a slit to look through. Also, going to the independent, parents spent 3 times less as much time with their children in the 70s as they do today. So that would make children very lonely if they had no friends. This relates to Edward because Burton must have felt like an outcast in society. To wrap it up, the Scissorhands shows how Edward is not just naive but capable of great things.